I generally oppose settlement expansion. Is a thing that Israel does incorrectly that I think is kind of like provocative to at least all the Palestinians in the West Bank, and it probably energizes hatred in the Gaza Strip for them as well.
In this clip from the Lex Fridman podcast, Ben Shapiro debates destiny about a variety of topics. It's actually a pretty interesting and long conversation, but what we're going to focus on here is Israel-Palestine. And what's surprising to me about this is how much alignment these two guys have on the situation. Ben Shapiro is kind of an staunch Israel supporter and has sort of made the case many times that, this is the only course of action they could take. My expectation was that they would differ more. What I think this clip does very effectively is outline the complexity in the region. And one of the things neither guy touches on is what to be done about the sheer body count. But ultimately, I'm going to share my thoughts as well, and I want to hear yours in the comments. But let's take a listen.
And can I ask about Israel? So you're both mostly in agreement, but what is
Israel? I don't know if I'd say that.
Okay, but as I'm learning, what is Israel doing right? What is Israel doing wrong in this very specific current war in Gaza?
Frankly, I think that what Israel's doing wrong is if I were Israel, okay, again, America's interests are not coincident with Israel's interests. If I were an Israeli leader, I would have swiveled up and out and knocked the bleep out of Hezbollah early.
What does that mean? What does that mean?
So I would have. Yoav Gallant, who's the defense minister of Israel, was encouraging Netanyahu, who's the prime minister, and the war cabinet, including Benny Gantz. So whenever people talk about the Netanyahu government, that's not what's in place right now. There's a unity war government in place that includes the political opposition. The reason I point that out is because there are a lot of people politically who will suggest that the actions Israel is currently taking are somehow the manifestation of a right-wing government. Israel currently does not have a quote-unquote right-wing government. They have a unity government that includes the opposition. In any case, Yoav Gallant was urging in the very early days of the war that Israel should turn north, and instead of hitting Hamas, they should actually take the opportunity to knock Hezbollah out, because Hezbollah is significantly more dangerous to the existence of the state of Israel than Hamas. I actually agree with that. As far as what Israel has been doing wrong in the actual war, I think that, again, from an American perspective, I think that Israel is doing pretty well. From an Israeli perspective, if I were Israeli, I would actually want Israel to be less loose about sending its soldiers in on the ground level. So Israel's attempting to minimize civilian casualties, and the cost of that has been the highest military death toll that Israel has had since the 1973 Yom Kippur War. I personally know, through 1 degree of separation, 3 separate people have been killed in Gaza. And that's because they're going in door to door. It's because they're attempting to minimize civilian casualties, and they're losing a lot of guys in this particular war. The problem that Israel has had, historically speaking, is that Israel got very complacent about its own security situation. They believed the technology was going to somehow correct for the hatred on the other side of the wall, that so our people have to live underground for 2 weeks at a time while some rockets fall, but at least it's not a war. And that complacence, bred what happened on October 7th. So to me, what Israel did wrong was years and years and years of complacence and belief in an Oslo system that is at root a failure, because you cannot make a peace agreement with people who do not want to make peace with you. So that's what I think Israel is doing wrong. I have a feeling there's going to be wide divergence on this point.
Maybe. In terms of broadly speaking, I generally oppose settlement expansion. Is a thing that Israel does incorrectly that I think is kind of like provocative to at least all the Palestinians in the West Bank, and it probably energizes hatred in the Gaza Strip for them as well. In terms of conducting warfare, the one thing that I always say to everybody, especially Americans, is you can't evaluate things from an American perspective. It's very stupid. It happened a lot with Ukraine, where people are like, oh, well, didn't they work with the Nazis? And like, weren't the Soviets the good guys? And it's like, well, in other parts of the world, it's not quite as simple. And I think the same is true for Israel-Palestine, that a lot of Americans will analyze the conflict as just being one between only Israel and Palestine, which it's not. It's a conflict between Israel and then Palestine, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran. Right now it is. I think that however, one area where I'll break with Ben is I think that minimizing civilian casualties and everything is very, very, very important. I think on the Israeli side, I don't think it's important so that the U.S. will stay with them, because I think the U.S. is probably going to stick with Israel as long as they don't do anything crazy. And I don't even think it matters for the international community. It definitely doesn't matter for the UN, because Jesus Christ. However, I think it's really, really, really important that I think that in the Middle East, broadly speaking, I think that leadership, especially in the Gulf, has gotten over the Palestinian issue. I think that leadership is kind of like, they don't care as much anymore. But the populations still care quite a bit. And I think that the main issue that Israel could run into is if the civilian death toll does climb too high, and if they start to hit this, 40, 50, 60,000 number of civilian casualties, they run the risk of the civilian populations in the surrounding Middle Eastern states becoming so antagonistic towards Israel that they start to take steps back towards normalization in the region. So, for instance, I know that Bahrain, I think, already pulled out their ambassador to Israel. My guess is going to be it's temporary. I know that on the public speaking side, you've got a lot of people condemning Israel for the attacks. And on the private side, you've got people telling Israel, please kill all of Hamas because this is untenable and nobody wants to work in this situation. I don't know if this ended up being true or not. I'm guessing it didn't, but I saw on a couple of Twitter accounts, it was leaked that potentially Saudi Arabia was considering installing a government in the West Bank that they would run.
No, I mean, I think Israel would love nothing better than that, but that is not
sure,
something the Saudis. Okay. One of the big problems in the Middle East is literally no one wants to preside over the Palestinians.
Yes.
No one.
So
in the Arab states, Israel, no one.
Yeah. So I think the issue is, and I'm largely actually, I'm very sympathetic towards the Palestinians because I think that for, since 48 and onwards, I think that all of the Arab states super gassed them up on that. They wanted the Palestinians to fight because they wanted to fight with Israel. However, as time has gone on and they've realized that it's kind of a lost cause, states have started to drop out. So you're getting these bilateral peace treaties with, Egypt and with Jordan. You're getting multilateral agreements like the Abraham Accords. And now the Palestinians are looking around and like, okay, well, you guys told us to fight all this time. And now the only people that we have supporting us are Iranian proxies. So the Palestinians are in a very weird spot where they've like lost all their support. I think that Israel, what I would say to be quote unquote critical of Israel is Israel needs to take strong steps towards peace that probably involves them enduring some undue hardship. So not the October 7th attacks, because Jesus, that's way too much. But, other types of, attacks that they might have to deal with that might cause some civilians to die that they don't come out over the top with and retaliate with if there's ever going to be peace in that region. However, another thing that I've always said is a huge problem between Israel and Palestine is I think that both sides think that if they continue to fight, it will be good for them. But the problem is one side is delusional. I think Israel wants to continue to fight because they get justifications for the annexation of the Golan Heights. They get justifications for expansions, especially into Area C, that I think they're probably going to try to annex soon. They get justifications for the increased military posturing towards the Gaza Strip and the embargoes. And Israel is right that if the conflict continues, really the situation only improves for Israel over time. But the Palestinians also all believe that if they keep fighting, they've thought this since 2000 under Arafat, that if they just keep fighting, they'll get better gains too, but that's not the case.
Is there a difference between...
I'm going to jump here too. One thing that Ben Shapiro said early on ignores and these guys are not addressing it directly, ignores the human toll, right? We talk about the Palestinians fighting. Certainly there are Palestinians who are fighting, but the civilian death toll in Palestine is absolutely, you can't get your head around it. It's so astronomical. And all of these guys are making interesting points, right? And from a political standpoint, it's true. Israel, if you can hold your nose and avert your eyes from the Palestinian body count and the women and children blown to pieces, then ultimately Israel is going to gain from this carnage. The Palestinians really have nothing to gain by fighting except obliteration. The more they fight, the more it justifies Israel's aggression. And at the end of the day, when all the Palestinians are dead, it's all Israel, right? And that seems to be the American stance as well. It's like, well, there's really no solving this in a way that preserves the Palestinians. So we'll say we want a two-state solution, but we'll continue to arm Israel so they can just hurry up and get it over with.
Palestinian citizens and the leadership, when you say that.
I love all people. I love all people around the world. And I think that when we analyze issues, I think that we have to be very honest with what the people on the ground think. And the idea that Hamas is just this one-off thing in the Gaza Strip is not only incorrect with the situation on the ground, it's also incredibly ahistorical. And the idea that like the Palestinians in the West Bank, of which I believe the most recent polling shows, I want to say 75 to 80% support the October 7th attacks. Palestinians in general want to fight in violent conflict with Israel. That's not just the position of the government. That's not just people. There's a reason why Abbas doesn't want to do elections in the West Bank. And it's because the Palestinian people really do want to fight with Israel. But to combat that problem is like, you have to get the UN on board. We've got to do an actual addressing of the Palestinian refugee problem, which is handled like a joke right now. Iran has to be brought to the table in terms of negotiations. There has to be huge efforts made to economically revitalize these like Palestinian areas, even though they're one of the highest recipients of aid in the world. You have to do something about the embargo and the blockade in the Gaza Strip, which isn't just maintained by Israel. It's also maintained by Egypt. You should ask why. There's a lot of things that have to happen to fix that problem. But the reality is I don't think Israel really wants to, because they get to continue their expansion into the West Bank, and I don't think anybody around the world really cares that much. So in a month we won't be talking.
God, that is breathtakingly cynical, but I actually think he's right. And the end result is this kind of enormous meat grinder that the Palestinian people, who, you know, have reasons why they're fighting. This didn't just happen. It's not all the Palestinian people's fault. It's extremely complicated, but the end of the day is they are just getting ground into pieces.
I will argue with that. The idea that Israel does not want to end the conflict is belied by the history of what just happened with the Gaza Strip. So when we talk about settlements, for example, Israel did have settlements inside the Gaza Strip. There were 8,000 Jews who were living inside the Gaza Strip in Gush Katif. Up until 2005, they withdrew all of those people. I mean, took them literally out of their homes. And the result was not the burgeoning of a better attitude toward the state of Israel with regard to, for example, you know, the Palestinian population in Gaza. In fact, it was more radical in Gaza than it was in the West Bank. The result was obviously the election of Hamas, the October 7th attacks, in which unfortunately many civilians took part in the October 7th attacks. There's video of people rushing, who are civilians and dressed in civilian clothing, into Israeli villages.
Not always the same thing.
Well, no, that is 100% true, obviously. And when it comes to, you know, Area C and Israel's, you know, supposed deep and abiding desire for territorial expansion in Area C. So for those who are not familiar with the Oslo Accords, and again, this is getting very abstruse, but the Oslo Accords are broken down into 3 areas of the West Bank. Area A is under full Palestinian control. That'd be like Jenin and Nablus, the major cities, for example. There's Area B, which is mixed Israeli-Palestinian control, where Israel provides some level of military security and control. And then there's Area C. And Area C was like to be decided later. It was left up for possible concessions to the Palestinian Authority if the Oslo Accords had moved forward. Those are disputed territories. There is building taking place in Area C by both, actually, no one talks about this, but by Palestinians as well as Israelis. And
that's disproportionately outbalanced, though. I mean, one thing I want to say, too, is if you look at those maps at a glance, if you don't have any familiarity with it, you can just see at a glance how complicated. You know, it's not Berlin, where they had the, you know, Berlin Wall down the middle of it. It's like a leopard skin.
The question as to whether, if Israel stopped building, there have been many settlement freezes in the past, including some undertaken by Netanyahu. And it actually has not done one iota of good in moving the ball forward in terms of actual negotiations. Again, the biggest problem is that the leadership for Palestinians has spent every day since really 67. It's not even 48, because between 48 and 67, Jordan was in charge of the West Bank and Egypt was in charge of the Gaza Strip. And at no point did either of those powers say, hey, maybe we ought to hand this over to an independent Palestinian state, which was originally the division that was promoted by the UN partition plan in 47. Because of that, the leadership post 67 and really starting in 64, the Palestine Liberation Organization was founded in 64, and it called for the liberation of the land. In 64, they had the West Bank and they had the Gaza Strip. So they're talking about Tel Aviv. When it was founded in 64, the basic idea, as you know, kind of indicated by that, was Israel will not exist. And that was a promise that's been made by pretty much every Palestinian leader in Arabic to the people that they are talking to. Yasser Arafat famously would do this sort of thing. He'd speak in English and talk about how he wanted a 2-state solution, and then he'd go back to his own people and say, this is a Trojan horse, and we're going to... If Israel could, if you think that Israeli parents want to send their kids at the age of 18 to go and monitor Jenin and Nablus and be in Khan Yunis, you're out of your mind. You're out of your mind. Israelis do not want that. In fact, Israelis didn't want that so much that they allowed rockets to fall in their cities for full-on 18 years in order to avoid sending soldiers en masse back into the Gaza Strip.
True, but I think Israel does want to continue to expand settlements into the West Bank, right? They want to continue to build. They want to have all of Jerusalem, East Jerusalem as well.
Well, I mean, East Jerusalem has already been annexed. So East Jerusalem is, according to Israel, a part of Israel. That's not a settlement.
Sure.
Okay, so there's that. With regard to, does Israel have an interest in expanding settlements in the West Bank? Why would they not until there's a peace partner?
Sure, that's what I mean. But I'm saying as long as the conflict continues, because even when you talk about
but your suggestion is that they're incentivizing the conflict to continue so they can grab more land.
Well, no, let me be very clear. I don't think there's a plan. So some people say, for instance, they'll take that one quote from Netanyahu and they'll try to say that he was funding the people in the Gaza Strip by allowing Qatari money to come in, even though he was actually speaking in opposition to Abbas, allowing the Gaza Strip to fall for Netanyahu to clear it out for him and then give it back, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not claiming those theories. I'm just saying that I think that Israel will take a relatively neutral stance towards conflict enduring, because as long as the conflict endures and as long as the settlements can expand, I think that ultimately benefits Israel.
I think there would be let's put it this way. If suddenly there arose among the Palestinians a deep and abiding desire for peace, approved by a vast majority of the population with serious security guarantees, I think you'd be very hard-pressed to find Israelis who would not be willing to at least consider that in return for not expanding bathrooms in Efrat.
I would have agreed with you on October 6th. I think we're probably a year or two away from that right now.
But the point I'm making is that Israelis now realize that the entire peace process was a sham, meaning the people who are on the other side of the table were using it as a Trojan horse in the first place. The death of Oslo is not the death of Israeli hopefulness. It's the death of the illusion that on the other side of the table was anyone worth bargaining with. That's what's happening. And that's why you have this sort of insane disconnect right now between the United States and the Israeli government. Again, it's a unity government. No one in Israel is talking about making concessions to the Palestinian Authority for a wide variety of reasons, including the fact that Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah continues to pay actual families of terrorists who kill Jews.
Sure, the Martyr Fund, yeah.
Right, and
which is from the moderate West Bank.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, again, the taste in Israel for this is even the people who are the Chilonim, right? Those are the most secular people in Israel, which was, by the way, the place that was attacked on October 7th. I mean, what people should understand is that October 7th was not an attack against settlements in the West Bank. It was an attack on peace villages that were essentially disarmed. And many of these people who were killed were peace activists who were literally trying to work with people in Gaza to get them jobs. I mean, it's just, it's mind-boggling. That's why you've had this ground shift in Israel. The next 20 years in Israel is going to be about security and economic development, period, end of story. Everything else goes second, third place.
And I will say, I agree essentially with everything you're saying. Not to loop back on another topic, but this is one of the reasons then why I was so critical. I don't want to say critical, but kind of nonchalant about the Abraham Accords, because they didn't address anything with the Palestinians whatsoever. They brought in countries that weren't super relevant to the conflict. They didn't bring in Qatar, which is where a lot of the money and support for the Gaza Strip comes from. They didn't involve Iran at all. They involved bilateral.
No, but it totally changed the mentality. And this is why what I'm seeing right now, this is why, listen, I think that Biden has done better than I certainly expected him to do in terms of support for Israel. Obama was way less supportive of Israel than Biden by every metric. With that said, the rhetoric that he's been using recently and that Blinken have been using recently about Israel needs to make painful concessions for peace, recentering this issue at the center of relations in the Middle East is doomed to failure. The magic is a strong word. The benefit of the Abraham Accords was proof of what you're saying, which is true, which is that all of these surrounding countries in reality have abandoned the idea that there's a centrality to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That is not the central conflict in the Middle East.
I'm going to stop it there. These guys agree far more than I think most would expect them to. What they do highlight is how complicated the situation is and how it involves other, nations in the Middle East. It isn't simply an Israeli matter. It has to do with all the other countries in the surrounding area. None of this addresses the death toll, right? I mean, you can talk about 80% of Palestinians think blah, 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 blah. We're talking about body parts of women and children, right? We're talking about the absolute demolition of buildings. So you can bemoan Israeli casualties, and I certainly don't relish casualties of any kind. But the answer collectively seems to be, well, what are you going to do? I mean, all you can do is really liquidate the resistance, which is 80% by your own polling count. And I just feel like Americans may or may not understand it, but the idea that our tax dollars are going to pay for the bombs that Israel is using because they are our ally to essentially liquidate an entire people, even if they are sworn opposition, right? And we're talking Hamas, or you can say 80% of the population. That's just not a satisfying answer, right? It's not a sign. I don't have an answer. There isn't an easy answer. I don't see people rolling up their sleeves and trying to come up with creative solutions here. It sort of seems to be like these guys. Well, it's really complicated, and they don't seem to want to come to the table, and they never have. So, I mean, what are you going to do? We can't just let them kill us. And they're all combatants, right? All Palestinians are combatants, and therefore, we got to kill them all. And it just can't be acceptable. It certainly isn't acceptable to the American people, if you can believe, the polling on this. It's an extremely upsetting subject, and the body count is just unthinkable. It's unthinkable. But let me know what you think in the comments. Obviously there's going to be a spectrum of views on this, and if there were easy answers, we'd have figured it out. But, I want to hear your thoughts.